I've given many tours in my life, but the tour that I gave to you and your wife was one of the most memorable. Not every day that you get to show a founding father around a historic city.
So, Christian, thanks for joining us on the George Washington Speaks podcast. As you know, we've just started a new effort here, and we'll be building on that episode after episode. And we're right now in the beginning of a series of episodes with you because you know Boston so well. So,
Thanks, Vern. It's a
yes,
great pleasure to be with you.
what I thought we'd do in this first episode is just to get to know you better. And thank you so much for allowing us to interview you and, just ask you any questions we want there. And especially not only about you, but also the importance of Boston to the American Revolution, which was arguably without Boston, we may not have revolted at all. But I'll let you expound on that a little bit later. So, for those that aren't aware, a year ago, September, my wife Sandy and I went over and had Christian pick us up at our hotel and take us the Freedom Trail and much, much more. And I thank you for customizing what you do for George and for Sandy as we went through Boston. Now, I want you to realize, and you may not have known this, but before we contracted with anything, I did some in-depth research of the tour guides as well as the tour entities out there, and I selected 6 people to follow up with and ask questions. You were one of the 6. I whittled that down to 3 and actually did some a little bit more in-depth interviews. And I selected you because, quite frankly, you were very receptive. You were you knew the subject. You were also very interrelated. So all of those things, I really felt as though were head and shoulders above the other folks. They all had their strengths, but quite frankly, for our purposes, we felt as though you would be the best. And when we got there, of course, you showed us things that we didn't expect to see, and you had personal insights of individuals and events going on that really came, that things came alive. And then, of course, the very last thing that you kept was when we went to the Athenaeum, you took me up to the, I don't know, 10th floor, whatever it was, 4th or 5th floor, maybe. It seemed more like that, but they had a security guy there. We went up and went to that room with the light coming in with big windows, and off on one wall was Washington's personal library from Mount Vernon behind these doors with classes on it. And oh my gosh, I guess I never thought I'd ever see that. And there it was. And since then, I've watched a couple of different programs in which they refer to the library in the Athenaeum, and I sit there very smugly and to myself and say, yes, I know, I have been there, thanks to Christian. So I thank you so much for all that you did to prepare for us coming over. But I want to ask you, how did you get into this? I mean, what is your background? What is your interest? Did you just kind of fall into this? Can you take us back a little bit, how you got into tour guiding Boston and what have you? So, good sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vern. And I will say this before I begin. I've given many tours in my life, but the tour that I gave to you and your wife was one of the most memorable I've ever had. It's not every day that you get to show a founding father around a historic city. So to spend a day with George Washington, showing him the sites that were important to Washington's life in Boston, was quite a memorable experience. I'll never forget that. And I'm a big fan of yours, so I'm so thrilled to be here on your podcast. Thank you for inviting me. I guess the simple answer as to how I got into being a tour guide is good history teachers. Uh,
Okay.
when when I was in high school, I had a series of good history teachers. If they are somewhere out there in the internet listening, Mr. Flam, Mr. Filakoff, thank you very much for sending me on my trajectory. I went to college in Boston, having grown up in New Jersey, and I studied history and education at Boston College. I came out thinking that I was going to be a high school history teacher, and I was actually for about 3 years until one day it dawned on me that I didn't particularly like teenagers, which is a detriment to the teaching profession. So after about 3 years of teaching, I left to become a full-time tour guide. I had been a tour guide during the summers, beginning my junior year in college. I picked it up as a summer job, driving people around on the hop on, hop off trolleys that are so prevalent in most
Yes.
historic cities. And it was a good way to cut your teeth in the history and tour guide profession. As the old adage goes, do something for 10,000 hours and you'll finally be good at it. And I did more than 10,000 hours of
Oh
tours
gosh.
on those trolleys. I can guarantee you that. Loops after loops after loops, telling people the story of Boston, and it ingrained itself in my being, and it's something I've been passionate about now for over 20 years. About 10 years ago, I launched my own company. That company is called Top Tours of New England.
Okay.
The name comes from a phrase of Joseph Warren's, who I'm sure we'll talk about later in this
Yes.
podcast. Joseph Warren wrote a document called the Suffolk Resolves. It's a precursor to the Declaration of Independence. And in that document, he said that if he and his fellow countrymen did not deal with the injustices the British Crown was showing them, they would be subject to servitude and slavery. But if they did stand up for their rights as Englishmen, as human beings, a quote, torrent of panegyrists, unquote, would sing their praises into eternity.
Mm.
And so I chose the name of my company, Top Tours of New England, as an acronym for that torrent of panegyrists. And if you don't know what a panegyrist is, in ancient classical times, a panegyrist was a person who specialized in giving funeral eulogies. So it was a professional position who would get up at the funeral of an important figure and remember them. And so, what an appropriate term for a company that remembers important historic figures and our founding fathers. So, I started Top Tours of New England about 10 years ago. And boy, am I a fortunate guy, because what I do every day is spend the day with somebody else, show them the city of Boston on a private basis, cater to what their interests are. So each tour is a little bit different. They all share in common the history of Boston, but it really depends on the interests of the client. And I love my job. I'm very, very fortunate to do what I do. And it's a lifelong mission to continue to learn history. It's never ending. Every day I learn something new about Boston and about history in general.
Yeah, I get on the computer, go down looking for one subject information, and man, I just go down the rabbit holes here and there. So I'm with you. So you customized our tour, and that is then a strength of yours is the customization. Well, let me ask you, what did you have to do to customize the tour for George?
That was an interesting one, because when you first think of George Washington in Boston, there's not that many connections. After all, he was a gentleman farmer from Virginia. He was briefly in Boston at the start of the Revolution, but really after the Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775, the war progresses to the mid-Atlantic states and then eventually down to Virginia, where it ends in 1781. So there were only a few interactions with George Washington and Boston. But the thrill of customizing your tour was finding those interactions. And I learned in the process of crafting your tour that George Washington, as a young officer during the French and Indian Wars, had come to Boston to call on the British general who was in charge of all the soldiers in North America. He came to challenge a position of protocol, who had authority over whom within the context of the British military. Unfortunately for George, the decision did not go his way, but that was his first experience with Boston. Then he had all those times he was here at the beginning of the revolution. And then after he was elected president, he came back in sort of a farewell tour to visit Boston. So as you approached me, I took some time to research all of these different events, find different parts of Boston that were connected with Washington in these important moments in his life, and then craft a special tour for you. And I have to say, the cherry on the sundae, the special thing that I saved to the end and I didn't let you know until we walked into that room, was the fact that the Boston Athenaeum holds Washington's private library. We could physically stand next to these books that had been leafed through by Washington, that had been in his possession. And that it gave me goosebumps. And I've been a tour guide for 20 years. So that was pretty special.
The cabinets were locked. I couldn't get
Yeah,
into them.
security features, of course,
Yes.
probably would take even more special privileges to get your hands on those books. They're, of course,
I just
rare.
wanted to touch what Washington touched, is all.
Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't? Yeah, even getting into that, as you mentioned at the intro there, we had to sneak up. It was the 10th floor. Yeah, I wouldn't say sneak, but I had special privileges to get us into that room. That room is not normally a public space. We had it was very special that we could be in there.
We have done other private tours, and yours and Antonio's just blew the top off any of the tours we've taken. Antonio, we're in Naples. My wife is researching for a historical novel and having to do with popes and kings and war and intrigue and everything. And he showed us also through Naples, but the depth and the breadth of your all's knowledge, we couldn't ask you anything that you didn't know. And you and he both, it's a lifelong passion, and that comes through. So if somebody wanted to actually reach you and chat about a tour, how best would they go about doing that?
They should visit my website. It's
Okay.
Top Tours of New England.
Okay.
There's different tour offerings on there. Package tours are most popular tours. But then if they email me with their special interests, as we discussed, I'd be more than happy to customize and make something special for their interests. So Top Tours of New England. You can Google it. You can search it. It's toptoursofnewengland.com.
Okay. And tell them George sent you.
Absolutely.
As a tour guide for all that period of time, what do you find people are most surprised about in your tour, or maybe the biggest misconceptions they might have about Boston or revolutionary times?
It's so interesting. Anytime I pass a sanitation worker in Boston, I compliment them, because it's funny that you ask. It's an odd thing, but everybody who comes to Boston exclaims what a clean city it is. It's simple, but it's not. It takes a lot of work to keep a city clean. We have pride in Boston. The fact that it is clean makes it stay clean, and it really is a living museum. If you visit Boston and you walk the Freedom Trail, you walk past houses that are nearly 400 years old. You'll be able to stand at the spot where Paul Revere stood or George Washington stood. And that makes it a really special place. And so that's the number one thing that tends to, I get a reaction from. People always exclaim what a clean city it is. That, and then the depth of Boston's history. You initially think of the American Revolution, but really the Revolution was the halfway point in the history of Boston. There was 200 years of history before the Revolution began, and people sometimes forget about that Puritan era.
Okay. Okay. What about the funniest thing that ever occurred on one of your tours?
Oh gosh, there's been a lot of funny episodes. I had a group of school children. They were like about eighth graders. I was driving them around on a trolley, and we happened to go through a part of town that was a little seedy. And don't you know, I would call her a street walker, a
Oh,
woman of the night,
okay.
although it wasn't night, saw this group of young boys on the trolley and gave them a little show. She flashed them, and it was the best thing that could have ever happened to that trolley full of eighth graders. They'll never forget that, I'll bet. So that's pretty interesting. Oh gosh, my favorite kind of tours from a humor standpoint are the tours where people ask to go into a bar. You know, we've got a lot of historic drinking establishments in Boston.
True.
Sometimes people end up in a bar, and before you know it, 3 hours have passed, and we've spent the whole tour in the bar, which in many ways is the quintessential Boston experience.
Okay, the pub, the
Yeah,
Green Dragon. So, as I understand, the Green Dragon is no longer around from a standpoint of the original building, but that there's another establishment that claims the title of the Green Dragon. Is that correct?
that's correct. The Green Dragon was the meeting spot of the Sons of Liberty during the time of the American Revolution. Now, there is a bar in Boston today that calls itself the Green Dragon and is located in a historic area, but is not does not have a continuous line of establishment to the original Green Dragon. We are quite fortunate to have several locations, though, that can draw continuous lines of establishment, namely the Warren Tavern, which is over in Charlestown and named
Okay.
after Dr. Joseph Warren, who I mentioned earlier. That's been open continuously with a few breaks, prohibition and such, since 1781.
Oh
And
my
then
word.
the oldest continuously operating restaurant in America is the Union Oyster House. That's been open since 1826 in continuous operation. So we're pretty fortunate to have some old establishments in Boston.
I see. So, do you conduct a pub crawl as well, or a pub tour?
Absolutely. Yep. It's one of my favorite ways to discuss the history of Boston over a pint of Sam Adams, of course.
Yeah. So, what about for a tour guide? What typically is the most difficult things or the most irritating things for a tour guide?
Language barriers are often problematic.
Okay.
When I have a group that doesn't speak English, the lag in translation, whether I'm working through an interpreter or working through, we've even used apps, that could be problematic because the story doesn't quite flow the same way. So you have to pause. I tell you though, Vern, I find, especially in the private side of the business, one-on-one tours, people are good. That is one of my big takeaways from this profession that I've chosen is to just appreciate the goodness of people. And it's a very rare time when there's any problem or conflict with a tour. You know, when you're doing a group tour, like on a trolley or something like that, you know, you have people talk on their phones or break off into side conversations, and it disrupts the overall experience for everybody. But that's problematic on the group tours. Thankfully, I don't do too many large group tours anymore. For the most part, though, it's a great job, and people are great.
Okay. Well, that's interesting for the limited time that I have been doing George, 12 years. I find also people are very respectful and good. I think only 3 or 4 times there's been some amount of hostility, and yet a lot has to do with, of course, your and my response to that, not upping it, but just remain calm. I think I've seen that on some coffee cups there.
Yep.
Well, do appreciate your availability and uh, getting to know a little bit more about your background as well as those that are watching this. And the next few podcasts, we're anticipating that we are going to go from the surrounding Boston to Bunker Hill. And then the foray over to Fort Ticonderoga and Henry Knox bringing all that artillery over here, then Dorchester Heights, and then ending with the events leading up to Evacuation Day as well. So we've got much more to talk about. Thank you for this introduction, and then we'll go to surrounding Boston.
I'm looking forward to speaking with you, Vern. I'm excited about this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Christian. Till then.
Thanks. Okay.